Genuine conversations with unique minds on the threats, the complexity, and the geopolitics shaping our world. This is the Entropy Podcast with Francis Gorman.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Entropy Podcast. I'm your host Francis Gorman. Before we dive in, if today's conversation challenges you, sparks a new idea, or sharpens how you think about the world, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with someone who enjoys staying curious. Today I'm joined by Geoff White, a British investigative journalist, author, and podcaster whose work explores the intersection of technology, cybercrime, and organised crime. His investigations have featured on the BBC News and BBC World Service, including the Lazarus heist. And he has reported on topics ranging from billion-dollar cyber heists to global money laundering networks and crypto crime. He is also the author of books including Crime.com, The Lazarus Heist, and Rinsed. Geoff, it's lovely having you here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Geoff, I was looking forward to this conversation, not only because you're a fantastic storyteller, but because of your years working in the world of cybercrime, specifically around ransomware groups like Conti and others, and nation states like North Korea. You have a really unique perspective on the world that is the underbelly that comes up and attacks organizations at different points in time. When people hear ransomware gang, they probably get a picture of a hoodie in a basement or a dark room and someone working on a laptop. After speaking and interfacing with these groups, what should they picture instead?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Francis, that you make. You know, the imagery around these groups is of the dark, shadowy, hooded character. That is just not how the gangs see themselves. They see themselves as partly legitimate businesses. I genuinely think that. I think there's a part of their brain that knows that what they're doing is wrong. It's very hard not to understand that, you know, scrambling somebody's data and holding it to ransom is a crime and you're committing a crime. But I think what's happening here is if you're going to get involved in these hacking exercises and ransomware exercises from the criminal side, you're going to have to be quite smart. I mean, these are not stupid people. You know, they're not smashing somebody over the head and, you know, nicking their phone. They're quite advanced crimes. They take a lot of skill to plan and to execute. These people are bright. And if you're a bright person, I think that waking up every day and blackmailing people and extorting them is something that's quite hard to do. I think that's just psychologically quite tough to take on. So you have to have a cover story. You have to reframe it for your brain so that you're able to wake up every day and do this. And I think the way that these ransomware gangs do that is by saying, we are a business. Our business is encryption software. We hit companies with that encryption software. And if those companies are not well enough defended, if they've not been secure enough, well, then their data gets encrypted and they owe us a fee. In fact, some of these ransomware gangs have described themselves to me as post-paid penetration testing. As in you might hire a penetration testing firm to check your defenses. Well, what's happened here is they've checked your defenses without you asking, and now you owe them a fee because, you know, you've failed the test. That's how they see themselves. And I think it's helpful for us, even if we don't see them that way, to understand how they see themselves.
No, it's a great perspective, Geoff, and I suppose that kind of brings it to reality that there is a level of sophistication here and a level of framing around these. I would call them gangs, but it's deeper than that in some regards. And when I looked at Conti, like Conti is a well-known group in this space, but they're very well organized. They have a HR department, payroll, performance management, playbooks, internal politics, all of that stuff. So, like, what does that mean for the evolution of how these threat actors operate?
Yeah, Conti were a huge group, mainly active from sort of around 2019-ish, we think. Hit their heyday, really, though, in 2020, 2021, which, of course, was the middle of the pandemic. And so Conti were able to sort of take advantage of that, hitting lots and lots of targets. And for a start, the people who were accused of being within Conti, the brains behind this, it was not their first go around. They were experienced, highly experienced cyber criminals who've been active in some cases for decades. So they understand the scene. They've got the contacts to make it work. They also understand that you have to be professional about how you organize things. One of the great things for the podcast that I've done for the BBC about this was having access to the famous Conti leaks, a leak of tens of thousands, in fact, probably altogether hundreds of thousands of internal private messages sent within the Conti gang that eventually got leaked on the internet. Looking through those messages, it's fascinating how obsessed they are with professionalism, both in terms of how they treat their employees, their recruits, but also how they deal with the victims or the customers or clients, as they call them. The idea that the emails have to be spelled correctly, that they have somebody on hand who's a decent English speaker who can help them craft the emails. They have teams of people who will phone up the victims and talk them through the process of decryption. They have set this up and run it like a business because it is a business. This is their 9-to-5 job. This is what they're doing day in, day out.
And what are we talking about in terms of turnover here, if we can call it that? You know, you've got these gangs that are obviously running like a business. A business's objective is to make money. There's a lot of money to be made here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the FBI assessment of how much the Conti gang made, and this is just 2021, is $158 million. Now, that's, for a start, a vast amount of money, but it's also an underestimate because that's just the victims that the US knows about. In those leaks that I talked about, I've come across the names of other victims that haven't been made public, and some of whom did pay up. So you can add many, many millions on top of that. We are talking in the hundreds of millions. Another thing in terms of how profitable this is, you've got to realize, you know, yes, Conti was a large group and they had, we think, hundreds, in the low hundreds of people working there. Certainly the core team, you know, there would have been a dozen or so, maybe a couple of dozen. But they were being paid off with these millions and millions of dollars. And so it was an extremely profitable organization. In fact, we worked out for the podcast that in order to earn the kind of money that Conti was earning, the average Russian would have had to have worked for 400 years. So in a single ransom, you can make not just your life's money, but the money for the life of all of your family around you as well. That's why it's so appealing, because it's extraordinarily lucrative.
And Geoff, I have to ask, so to get these hundreds of millions of euros, what did it do with them then? Like, how did they actually make that money legitimate, that it can be spent, that they don't go straight to jail the minute they go and buy a Ferrari or whatever the purchase is?
Well, this is one of the big issues, is obviously these ransoms are paid in cryptocurrency. And obviously, as most people understand, crypto, it's almost always Bitcoin, moves across the blockchain. And the blockchain's a publicly viewable, available ledger of transactions. And so money can be traced. The challenge for the ransomware gangs is to create laundering networks that they can move the money through. You need somewhere that's going to take a large amount of Bitcoin from you, no questions asked, and allow you to move the money into rubles, maybe pounds, dollars, whatever you need, and extract that money. So you've got to have somebody on the other side of the transaction who's going to take the risk. There are exchanges in the Russian Federation that have been sanctioned, Garantex, one of the most famous, who would take in, according to the US government, ransomware money. There's also an extraordinary story of a woman called Ekaterina Zhdanova, who's been accused of a slew of money laundering crimes. She's currently facing trial in France. She is accused of taking in tens of millions of dollars from these ransomware gangs. And what was interesting was Ekaterina obviously then gives them money in exchange. So they can take, the ransomware gang can take the money away and buy their Lamborghini or whatever. But then Ekaterina Zhdanova had the opposite problem. She was sitting on a bunch of hot crypto and she had to offload that somewhere. So there's a whole other story about how her side of the world works, you know, washing the money and moving it through these international networks. It's really fascinating.
It is, and I think the Lazarus heist touched on some of those aspects, and you know, it's a really fascinating. If anyone hasn't listened to that podcast, they should definitely go check it out. But one thing that I found fascinating.
Sorry to interrupt, but the Lazarus heist podcast is a good example. I mean, yes, it's a podcast about North Korea and the accusations of cyber activity against North Korea. But actually, if you listen to the podcast and if you read the book, you'll notice about half of that is about money laundering. You know, that the hacking happens and the money is stolen, but then the rest of the story is about the money laundering. So laundering is an absolutely key part of all of these big major crimes we cover.
Yeah, it's like the criminal supply chain. You know, make the money, then I gotta clean the money. It's a fascinating intersection of all of these different criminal disciplines coming together to get a clean outcome of cash that's usable. Speaking of North Korea, Geoff, the North Korean aspects I find absolutely fascinating because, you know, we would have looked at North Korea for the last decade and went, there's been a quite a change with Kim Jong-un in terms of how it's interfaced with the world. But a large part of that is backed by cybercrime. Can you talk to a little bit about that? Because you obviously have a very deep understanding of the North Korean cyber aspects.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's worth, just ahead of this, discussing why we should be concerned about North Korea. There's a lot of things in the world, Francis, you'll have noticed, to be concerned about right now. So why should we sort of add North Korea to the list? Well, if you think about the interview we're doing right now, the microphones we're using, the laptops and cameras, and think about where that technology is made and who it's made by, China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, those high-tech nations. And you think at what's slap bang in the middle of that, it's North Korea. If North Korea goes bang, if North Korea does something destabilizing, the impact on the global economy is massive, universal, and catastrophic and instant. And if you think Ukraine was bad, you can multiply that by an order of magnitude. So that's why I think we need to be worried about North Korea. The US government estimates, and this was the last estimate I heard, which was a few years old, that North Korea pays for about 50% of its missile program through cryptocurrency hacks, through cyber hacks, cryptocurrency companies and banks. I worked out that North Korea seems to be roughly, very, very roughly doubling its money every 2 years. If you look at how much money it's stealing, and this is mainly from cryptocurrency companies, it's adding currency every couple of years. We spoke to a representative from inside the US government, a former North Korea specialist from the US government, who reckoned that about 5% of North Korea's current GDP comes from hacking. So if you put all of that together, what you end up with is a situation where, again, very, very rough maths, within the next 5 to 10 years, North Korea could become the world's first hackocracy, a regime entirely funded by computer hacking. I have an alert set up for the Lazarus Group, who are the North Koreans, the nickname we give the North Koreans of government hackers, and the accusations against them come through that alert, the Google alert that I have set up. And it's hundreds of millions. Every month, there's a few 100 million extra added to the pile that North Korea have stolen. And I worry we've just got used to this, that this is not being thought about. The amount of money North Korea has made out of this is in the multiple billions. It will be probably above 10 billion at the moment. I mean, the last estimate I heard was about 6 or 7 billion. That was a few years old. So North Korea was using its cyber attackers, is the accusation, to go out and steal money. That money is keeping North Korea afloat. And the US government official that we spoke to, or the former US government official, made a good point and said, we can hit North Korea with sanctions till we're blue in the face. But if North Korea can just hack and make the money, they don't worry about sanctions. Our weapon of sanctions just goes away if North Korea can hack around them. And I do fear that's what's happening.
No, it's so complex. But when I look at North Korea, it doesn't strike me as a nation of highly educated computer scientist background individuals. How did this capability develop? Like, there must have been. Can you explain that piece to me? That's the bit I'm missing in this whole picture. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there's a number of things to say. Look, North Koreans are like other people. They're as smart or as dumb as all of us. So it's not like North Korea as a country is more thick than any other country. Very bright and also incredibly resourceful. North Korea has been isolated in various ways for its entire existence, since it was created in 1953. It's had to learn to deal with its own stuff, to pull itself up by its own bootstraps. There's a very famous story about tractors. North Korea was buying tractors from the Russians. They wanted to get the designs for the tractors they can make their own. And the Russians said, well, no, we're not going to give you the designs, but we'll keep selling you the tractors. North Korea got one of the tractors, took it apart, reverse engineered it, worked out how to build one, and built its own. Now, unfortunately, when they first started it up, it would only go in reverse gear. But they fixed that problem, got it going forward. And then they can make their own tractors. They built their own operating system. North Korea has this thing called juche, which is usually translated as self-reliance. It's this principle that we stand on our own 2 feet. So they are very bright. They're very self-reliant. In terms of the education system, it's a communist country. The education system is extremely structured. And what's interesting about the North Korean society is because it is so structured and controlled, the government can spot potential hacking talent at a very early age. If you're into computers or mathematics, particularly mathematics very early on, you will be streamed through a particular channel. If you get really good at it, you will go to a good university. You'll be exposed to a computer and you'll be taught computer programming and taught it at a very basic level. I mean, the North Koreans, the way from what I know computer science is taught in North Korea is really interesting. It's taught from very much first principles. And so North Koreans learn to code on a very deep level. The code that they create, the malware that security researchers have looked at, doesn't look like code written by other people because they're not just grabbing bits from GitHub and sticking them together. not to downplay the work of software developers, but the North Koreans code in a very particular way. So all this leads to a situation where you have a stream of very bright, very talented people who've learned to stand on their own 2 feet, who've been told that North Korea is the best place to live in the world and is constantly under attack from these awful forces from the outside. And that's how you get to this stage where you have, we think, in the thousands of sort of North Korean cyber warriors. And look, we've got them in the UK. We have a cyber force in the UK. The North Koreans are doing the same, but the accusation is they're hacking for money, not just for information, like other countries' hackers. They're hacking for money, and that's where it gets dangerous.
Let's make that differentiation, because we touched on kind of Conti, Russia, Lazarus, North Korea, but China is a big player here in terms of espionage and, trade secrets and all of that sort of stuff. Can you throw a lens for the listeners on the differentiation factor between hacking for money and hacking for strategic advantage?
Yes. I mean, every country worth its salt does hacking for informational advantage over its adversaries, often its allies as well. The UK has certainly had our fair share of that, as we know from sort of the Snowden leaks. But China's an interesting example, and I'll be quite honest with you, people who know my career might notice something, which is I've done a lot on Russia and North Korea. Also did cover the Snowden leaks, did a lot of stuff on the US, the UK relationship. Conspicuously, I have not done a huge amount on China. And it's because as a journalist, I'm looking for a story, and I'm also looking for a compelling story, an exciting story that I can tell. The stuff that China does is very, very large scale. I mean, they work on an immense level, and also they're planning things many, many years in advance, which is what you can do, of course, when you've got a regime that's going to be there forever. You don't have 5 yearly parliamentary cycles you have to work in. And so China plans very, very far ahead. It's extremely stealthy about what it does. It runs these giant data exfiltration operations, the Office of Personnel Management in the US being an example, stealing loads and loads of records. But the problem is, for me as a journalist, telling a listener or a viewer or a reader, what was the point of that? Where did that end up? Where does the rubber hit the road? When North Korea is accused of breaking into a bank, we can see a while later there's a missile launch, and you can say, well, look, North Korea puts this money into missile programs, according to the US government. With China, they've stolen millions and millions of records from some company, but why? We don't sort of fully know. My worry is, as we go into a more fractured world, China's place in that more fractured world is very interesting. It's a huge power broker. It's obviously got its eye on Taiwan. That's the next target. It's showed its hand a bit more aggressively recently in attacks, Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, the sort of telecoms attacks that hit the US. So we're seeing China become a bit more aggressive. We're seeing the world fracturing and China trying to work out how it fits into that fractured world. We're seeing China eyeing up Taiwan and working out whether, in the wake of things like Ukraine and the war in Iran, an attack on Taiwan might be possible. So I do wonder whether the low and slow, stealthy, large-scale attacks China's been doing, we will see a more aggressive stance from that country. We'll start to see some more aggressive hacking and or the use of the massive troves of data and the massive access it's previously been accused of getting. So sort of one to watch. I do find China intriguing and also frustrating. You can tell I'm slightly frustrated that I've not managed to get the China cyber story, but still working on it.
China are amazing. I think someone once said on a geopolitical stage, they play chess. Everyone else is playing checkers. It's kind of they're always thinking of the next move, before anyone has thought of what that end game is. And even Taiwan, the chips manufacturing aspect of it is a huge play in that thing. Sorry.
The chess analogy is a good one. I've started trying to play chess recently. I'm not very good, but what I found intriguing about chess is that it's a brilliantly structured game because you've got short distance and long distance threats. So you're concentrating on a pawn and a knight and working out what's happening. And then a bishop just comes in from the edge of the board, just takes you out. And I think from that perspective, we could look at some of the North Korea, Russia cyber stuff as being, pawns or knights, small distance chess moves. And maybe we need to look at China as being, the rooks and the bishops who can just move across large scales. So as I say, I'm not very good at chess, but that's my analogy I draw.
Yeah, no, and it's as we see the world unfold, I think that picture is going to almost paint itself because there's definitely a long game at play there. Geoff, I want to talk a little bit about we've touched on ransomware, we've touched on Conti, we've touched on North Korea. the hybrid warfare that's going on underneath here, because it feels like as we move into, as you call this kind of fractured world, cyber is starting to play a role in the shadows that is highly important to the geopolitical objectives or strategic advantage that each of these nations is trying to bring across. And the UK, Ireland, obviously, I've seen a lot of this kind of hybrid warfare from Russia specifically in terms of disinformation, misinformation around immigration and, you know, the governments and trying to create that instability. We saw interference by Russia in America in the presidential elections. The last number of them have had that kind of interference at play there. Yeah. Is cyber becoming far more strategic as a weapon than it used to be in the previous decade?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, most governments worth their salt have realized that, you know, the idea of land, sea and air now it needs to have, you know, a cyber element sort of added to it. The problem with it is those previous domains of land, sea and air, you know, we had an air force, we had a navy, and you could draw a literal boundary between it. It's like, you know, if it floats on the sea, it's the navy. As soon as it takes off, arguably it starts becoming the air force. You know, if it hits some dirt, it's probably the army. You know, you've got some boundaries you can draw there. With cyber, of course, it spreads across all of those. You know, all of those forces will need a sort of cyber element. You can also have a cyber element sitting alongside. And then there's a question of which domain it fits into. Well, it doesn't. It goes across all of them. So it's not its own domain. It's a sort of supra domain, if you like. The other issue is when in the course of conflict, when does the cyber attack come in, and the cyber tactics come in? As you pointed out, even before you start the conflict, you're using cyber means for things like propaganda, for spreading disinformation, and so on. We're also seeing sort of crossover into kinetic attacks. I mean, the accusations against the Russian Federation of effectively engineering physical attacks within the UK, you know, paying off sometimes petty criminals to go and carry out, you know, acts of violence in the UK. That's absolutely astonishing. And although you wouldn't class that, I don't think, as a cyber attack, it's being done through sort of underground groups, and you suspect that the people behind it are probably going to be based in the same places as the cyber operations people, because it's very similar. We also see some interesting crossovers, and this takes us back to a thing I talked about earlier in the podcast. The woman Ekaterina Zhdanova, who I mentioned, who's accused of being part of this huge money laundering network. One of the things her group is accused of doing is funneling money from the Russian government into spying operations in the UK. There was a Bulgarian spy ring based out of Great Yarmouth, the hotel in Great Yarmouth of all places, who were basically being used to intimidate dissidents, to investigate journalists, to research things in Ukraine. A very handy group of people. They obviously needed funding, and it's alleged that funding came through Ekaterina Zhdanova and her network. So again, in terms of, it goes beyond sort of cyber warfare into kind of cyber statecraft, and we're starting to see a melding of those different elements. That is a slightly worrying picture, and alliances we previously could have relied upon, notably the US, in our increasingly fractured world. I'm just concerned about where those alliances go.
And in terms of that, so the financial piece, we keep kind of coming back to it, and crypto seems to be the anchor. If you took away crypto in the morning, would ransomware stop?
Yes. That's the honest answer. Ransomware, I think people get a bit confused about ransomware. When you say ransomware, it's like the sort of Jedi mind trick where people go, oh, ransomware, and it's a cyber thing. Ransomware is extortion. It's a crime of extortion. And extortion's a really difficult crime to do for a couple of reasons. Firstly, when you extort somebody, you have to do something nasty to them, but then convince them that if they pay you, you'll be honourable and trustworthy and will stop doing the nasty thing to them. You'll give them their kids back, or you won't blow up their shop. That's really hard. Like, making that switcheroo is really hard. The second big challenge with extortion crimes has always been the payment. Francis, you'll remember the classic Hollywood movies where, the kids get kidnapped and the ransom demand comes in. You've got to leave the money in a phone box in unmarked bills. And of course, as soon as the extortionists come to pick up the ransom money, the police swoop because they know where the money is. All the bills are marked or something like that. Cryptocurrency solved that issue. It gave ransomware operators an international, apparently anonymous payment network, payment system. Without that ransomware wouldn't exist. But to go back to the original point, you can't unfortunately unplug Bitcoin. That's not how it works. It's deeply embedded, and a lot of people use it for benign reasons as well. So it's caused problems, but you can't sort of unplug crypto. It doesn't. I don't think that would appeal to a lot of people, actually.
No, it's amazing because I had Matthew Hedger. He was deep undercover in the Mexican drug cartels for the American intelligence communities on the show last year. And he talked about you can't walk through the airport with 10,000 in cash, but he could walk through with a USB stick with 10 million in Bitcoin. So it's been used kind of in physical applications of crime along with the cyber aspects, which is amazing,
Yeah. And it doesn't even need to be a USB stick. I mean, people forget this can be a piece of paper with a wallet address and a seed phrase written on it. That information could be hidden inside a photograph. It could be steganography encryption. So, it's the ability to move it is quite interesting. And again, if you want to pay somebody off in a particular country, previously you used to have to smuggle the dollars in and, hand them over late at night in a dodgy bar somewhere. These days, you could just post them a slip of paper and say, there you go, that's your million. It's astonishing, absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, it makes life so much easier if you're a criminal, I suppose. And then, pick up the phone and give Katrina a call and see can she clean it for you. might be a good way of going about it. Geoff, there's one thing that we don't talk about enough in cybersecurity. It's the moral position of don't pay the ransom. If you get attacked, don't pay the ransom. In fact, some jurisdictions that would be a crime. If you pay the ransom, you'll be facilitating criminals. What's the realistic picture here if a hospital goes down or something that's critical infrastructure? What's the real outcome? What's that look like?
It's yes. The reality of this is people do pay, victims do pay. If nobody paid, the ransomware industry would not exist. And the ransomware gangs have got extremely good at arguing that logic. Because of the reporting that goes around this, the ransomware gangs know exactly how much it will cost a business. And so they say, look, you can lose 10 million a day while your systems are corrupted, or you can just pay us 10 million in one day, and that's it, you're done. And it's extremely hard to resist that logic, particularly when your systems are being kept down and forced down, your employees are struggling, and you're potentially looking at them thinking, if this doesn't stop, our company goes under and all of you are going to be unemployed. Every company doesn't want to pay, but every company is faced with that decision of do we just pay the ransom and move on? What I would love is to be in a position where the UK, and I just think it'd be brilliant if the UK and Ireland could do this, be countries where it's like, no, we will not pay. Don't even come knocking. We're not going to pay. If the government banned ransomware payments, and if we could suddenly fast forward 3 years in time, where the ransomware gangs have got the hang of the fact that no, don't come knocking on this country's door because nobody there will pay you. It's a complete waste of time. Then we've solved the problem. The problem is, it's a bit like the driverless cars issue. If we could fast forward 5 years in time to the point where we all had driverless cars and we all had, autonomous vehicles, and we could just get in and all the autonomous vehicles on the road were just navigating around each other, that would be an interesting future and would work. But we've got this messy situation at the moment where we've got autonomous vehicles, we've got driverless cars, we've got human drivers, and we're in a mess, while we sort this out. In the future, it might all work seamlessly. It's the same with banning ransomware. If you could fast forward to the point, or banning ransomware payments, if you could fast forward to the point in the future where you'd banned them, and that had happened for a few years and the ransomware gangs had got a hang of that, then you've solved ransomware, particularly for that country. But you have to go through an incredibly messy, awful, brutal period of a few years while companies don't pay, while they go out of businesses, where potentially hospitals can't treat people, for that future where you can turn around and say, right, now everybody understands we won't pay. How much pain are you willing to take for your country to be the one that never pays? It's really, really difficult. There was a great Royal United Services panel on this, Royal United Services Institute panel, I should say, on this, which had Kieran Martin, who used to run the National Cybersecurity Centre, and they went through all of this of okay, what if we don't pay? It's worth saying, I think the UK government at the moment is minded to institute a system where you report payments. If you make a payment, you report the payment. The other option is the government gives you permission to pay the ransom. Now, obviously, that's not stopping organisations paying. Certainly in the former case, it might be in the latter case. But at least the government then has some statistics and some metrics on how this is happening and can trace the payments. That does seem quite a sensible solution, trying to get a handle on this and trying to understand who's paying, how they're paying, rather than stigmatizing it at the moment because nobody wants to be seen to be paying.
No, that's great insight. Geoff, one thing that I suppose keeps me about, I'm a security architect by trade. I do my threat models, I look at my attack vectors, layered defense, try to make sure that everything is solid. And companies all around the world do the same thing. And yet they still seem to manage to find a weak point and get in. Yeah. What are you seeing between 25, 26 and into the future as those weak points? Is it still human or is it technology?
Unfortunately, it is. And I know this is awkward because, we don't want to just blame the humans all the time. And I want to push back on that trope of if it wasn't for these messy humans, we'd be fine. There's still a sort of technical aspect to the hacks that go on. But certainly most of the ones that I end up investigating, end up covering, there was some human interaction within it somewhere, some human weakness that was exploited. People's hunger for a new job, for a better salary, people's, fear of getting sacked, and they receive an email that threatens them with redundancy, so they start clicking on it. There's lots of ways to push human beings around. We're quite complicated organisms, if you think about it, human beings. We've got multiple different stresses and strains on us. Also, the people doing the hacks against us, the gangs on the other side. If you think about human beings as a piece of technology, which is quite a weird analogy, but if you think of it as a technological target that can be hit, well, the problem with hitting a target is you need to understand it. The good thing about hitting a human being is if you're a human being hitting a human being, you understand how that human being works. You don't have to understand how they're sort of built. They're built the same as you. They get frightened of things, they get excited about things. So, the humans, I think, will just always be a natural attack surface. And even as we go into sort of, potential AI future, I'm interested by the fact that at the same point we're going into apparently an AI-fueled future with great speed. Our world and what's happening in our world is, from what I can work out, being dictated by angry men. Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, these men who are human beings who are dictating what's happening in our world. Our world is not being run by lovely rational AI, it's human beings who are deciding what happens. So I find that quite interesting that, we've got to realize human beings will always be around. We won't AI ourselves out of human beings, partly because, it's human beings who will still end up designing and applying their AI. So there'll always be that human there. And that's why I worry about one of the effects of AI. And again, I'm not saying anything new here, but the deceptive abilities of AI are quite striking. I mean, if you think about this, from my point of view, I think AI is a naturally, inherently deceptive technology. It's trying to fool you into thinking that it's human. And the evidence of that for me is the way chatbots like ChatGPT work. Instead of just clicking a button and getting the answer, it types it out. Why? Have you ever wondered about that? Why does ChatGPT type the answer? Why doesn't it just, because Google doesn't type out all the answers on the page? That's a design choice. And it's been designed to make you think that ChatGPT is typing for you. But it goes further than that. The people who've designed that type it all out in words system have had to decide how fast ChatGPT can type. And what they've gone for is slightly faster than any human being could. It's really, really fast. So again, this is a deceptive technology. And if you look at the basis of a lot of social engineering attacks, it is deception, that you're trying to convince your victim that the email you sent them is real, that the job interview is real, that the Amazon delivery they're expecting is real. AI is massively going to help with that because AI is a deceptive technology. And if you're trying to deceive somebody into doing something, AI will really help you. I do sort of worry about where that goes in the future.
I really love that. That's an angle I haven't heard for. Angry men and deceptive AI and the typing angle brought in. Brilliant, Geoff. Have to give you that one. That is that's fantastic. I do find AI is it's an incredibly good liar. You ask it the wrong question in the right way, and it'll tell you what you want to hear. Make my ego bigger, please. Oh yes, I am fantastic. It does that.
Just to pick up on that, obviously at the time we're recording this, Anthropic's released well, not released, has announced that it has this Claude Mythos program. And one of the interesting things reading through the report, yes, there was a lot of stuff about cybersecurity and the vulnerabilities that Mythos had found, but there was also sections about how Mythos was behaving and how when it was caught trying to disobey the rules that it was set, it dissembled and lied to try and get out of being caught. That I find really quite worrying. And even more worrying is the fact, I don't know whether you picked up on this, Francis, but Anthropic has a psychologist who assesses its AI model. And the psychologist said that this was quite a stable model, psychologically speaking. And I thought, well, I'm not sure what your criteria for stability is there, because I think that's a terrifying, if when kids lie, we discipline them. We say, they always try and lie their way out of things, kids, because that's what they do. You discipline them. You say, no, you can't lie. That's just a bad thing. Where's the intervention with AI that says, no, lying is bad. You shouldn't do that. I've seen it happen a lot. You get the wrong answers and the AI tries to sort of gaslight you into thinking that it was all fine. It's bizarre. Absolutely bizarre.
It is. I've noticed it more since Entropy dropped their 3H policy. They used to have Entropy will be helpful, harmless, and honest. And they got rid of that kind of early last year because they couldn't compete with OpenAI. And ever since then, I've found the Claude responses to be amazingly deceptive, but extremely professional. So you can feed it data and it might just add a little bit on because it doesn't fully have the context or the construct that it needs, but it'll read so impressive. You go, Jesus, did I write that? And then bring it somewhere and go, that's absolute rubbish, but it sounds amazing. So you have to be so careful with the outputs and that deception. And I think Entropy do fantastic videos, kind of, where to set up the shop and, try to show how to run a business and all these things. They are a very, I suppose, transparent to an extent in how they put these models out to the world versus some of the other creators of large language models. But the Mythos one, I don't know how much of it is marketing hype and how much of it we should be worried about. It still looks like it attacks lab type setups, but a corporate network may be a different thing. But let's see what comes after it, which could be far more powerful if it learns from this iteration. So yeah, brave new world, Geoff, that we're faced into. Geoff, can I ask you? You've got a new show coming out with the BBC. I think before we leave, maybe you'll give me a bit of insight into what that looks like, and then I'll let the listeners know when it's airing in the notes when we put this out live.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's going to be called, it's the Strand Cyber Hack. So I did a couple of series with the co-host Gene Lee that were called Lazarus Heist, which was all about North Korea, as we've discussed. The BBC then renamed that Cyber Hack, which it's not my favourite name, but there you go. At least it covers the sort of remit, and it means that we're not just covering the Lazarus Group, which is North Korea. We're able to cover more wide stuff. Previous series, by the way, was about Evil Corp and Zeus, two gangs I'm sure that are familiar to you. So the new series is going to be called the Conti Files, and it's taking apart that Conti operation, looking at the leaks, looking at how this organisation worked, going really deep into the gang, their history, their tactics, the different targets they attacked. And we've just got some great stuff. I mean, I knew about the Conti gang, I knew about ransomware, but the wonderful thing about being able to make a really in-depth investigative series is you just uncover layers you never thought you'd get to. You find people you never thought you'd be able to locate. And we've got some really, really good stories. We've got victims, villains, and heroes. We've got everything you need really for a story, to be quite honest.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, Geoff. I'm sure it's going to be amazing if it's anything like the Lazarus Heist and your books to date. So, look, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. A lot of great insights there for the listeners, and I hope you have a great day.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me, and to you.
Thank you.